Hello and welcome to Cognitions, a podcast in which we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it might apply to our everyday lives. Tanai and myself have some good news. As you might be able to hear, we have had an audio upgrade. And so now we can bring to you these interviews with psychologists, linguists, computer scientists, neuroscientists, philosophers, etc. in higher quality. And this will be the case for today's episode and upcoming ones. Let's just jump into it then. Hello and welcome to Cognitions, episode 7. I'm with today's hosts. I'm Jay.
And I'm Tanai.
Most actions humans take are social in nature. If they are not directly geared towards affecting others' behaviors and thoughts, they're at least likely to have some impact on their lives. One can wonder if there's something special in one's mind that determines their behaviors that are oriented towards others. After all, we do colloquially talk of social skills or social intelligence. So what is so special about social behavior? Another domain that makes the question painfully apparent is that of progress requiring collective action. Indeed, why are we so reliably capable of learning a difficult new skill, or getting a job, caring for our family, which are examples of things that require much practice and commitment, and why at the same time are we seeing large-scale inaction regarding climate change? How can the cognitive scientist explain this? What are the cognitive, neural, and environmental determinants of our social capacities? What motivates us in our social lives? Today's guest is the person to answer these questions, or at least some of them.
She is Coralie Chevalier, a behavioral scientist at the Institut Jean-Nicot. After having done her PhD at University College London, she did multiple postdocs at the Center for Autism Research at the University of Pennsylvania and King's College, College's Institute of Psychiatry. During her career, she has worked on many topics, both fundamental and applied, including things like autism, social motivation, grit, climate change policy, and much more. Welcome, Coralie. We are so delighted to have you on the show.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So just to get us started for our listeners, could you describe your academic journey till now and how you got interested into cognitive science?
Yes, thank you. So I got interested in cognitive science in a rather indirect way. I very much initially somebody who's on the humanities side. I did my first undergraduate degree in English, civilization and literature. And then I studied linguistics. And through linguistics, I discovered Noam Chomsky and thought a little bit by accident, to be completely frank, because the time of the class matched what I wanted for my timetable. So it was totally by accident. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I want to dig more into that. So I did an undergraduate degree, another one in cognitive science. And then I joined a master in cognitive science.
And just from starting from linguistics, you sort of moved towards, let's say, autism and broader behaviors. Like how did you sort of make that link, if you would care to explain a bit
The
more?
reason why I've always been interested in literature and linguistics is because those activities are eminently social. The reason why we communicate is social. The reason why we understand what other people are saying is social. And when somebody writes a sentence, there's much more to it than the strict meaning of words. And the much more to it is very social in nature. So I got interested in pragmatics. And that's what led me to want to study cognitive science more. And also to try and understand why some people get stuck on the literal meaning of sentences more than others. Why for some people it's harder to understand irony, sarcasm, metaphors, whereas for other people it's very intuitive. And that's how I got interested in autism spectrum conditions. At the time, people thought of those conditions as being a very good examples of a different understanding of communication, one in which pragmatics and everything that goes beyond the literal meaning of words is difficult to understand. So the reason why I got interested in autism was very much as a sort of model to understand what's more to communication than the literal meaning of words.
Super cool, super cool. And I think we're going to dig further into this at the later parts of the episode. But just to sort of get some terminological clarity before we sort of dig deeper. So you also call yourself a behavioral scientist. So is there a difference between a behavioral scientist and a cognitive scientist?
That's a very good question. I think that there are many behavioral scientists who are not cognitive scientists because they look at behavior without trying to trace them back to cognitive mechanisms. Actually, you can do this. You can look at the way people behave and describe their behavior without having a mechanistic approach to their behavior. That would be a purely behavioral scientist. You can also, I guess, be interested in cognitive mechanisms without being interested in the way those affect and impact behavior, in which case you would be purely interested in cognition and not in the way in which it manifests in behavior.
So could you give a quick example of what this would look like?
Yeah, I think maybe, say you're interested in memory, you're interested in how people memorize words. Perhaps you could focus all your life on the memorizing memory mechanisms, but you wouldn't look at the way in which this impacts behavior. And that would be an interesting research program, but one that would be focused on the mind and the way it computes various signals all the way to encoding and memorizing them, but which wouldn't bridge all the way to behavior. And that's fine. What I'm interested in is to try to do both. Sometimes in my work, I look just at behavior. Sometimes I look just at cognition. But most of the time, I'm excited if I can do both at the same time.
So just jumping right into some of the themes of your work then. And so a big theme of your early work is social motivation, which is one of the cognitive things that you looked at, presumably. So can you describe for us what that is?
Yes. So social motivation is a very broad term, and it encompasses many things, a range of psychological processes and mechanisms. But they all have in common that they drive people to engage in social activities and to seek social interactions. So there are various aspects to social motivation: social orienting, which is our sort of instinct to pay attention to the social world. Very naturally, we get attracted by faces, voices, and we sort of have a predisposition to hone in on those social signals, very often at the expense of other signals around. It's really like we have tunnel vision for social signals. Social seeking and liking, which is very much tied to the reward system. So that means that we place value on social interaction. We enjoy social interactions, social connection, social affiliation. And the third one is social maintaining, which refers to the fact that we have a drive to care about our relationships with others. And that can take two forms. One is that we look out for cheaters. We try to detect people who are trustworthy. And the other part is that we care about our own reputation. We try to make sure that we maintain, hence the word social maintaining, a good social image. So I think that this domain, this very broad domain of social motivation, is really interesting and interdisciplinary in and of itself, because it's really at the intersection between social psychology, behavioral economics, social neuroscience, and evolutionary approaches to behavior, which I care deeply about. So that's the reason why I became interested in social motivation, because I think that it's present in all of our lives in a very deep way, and also in at some extent in various pathologies. But I'm sure we're going to discuss this again.
And the three aspects of social motivation you mentioned, so the paying attention to social cues, the reward seeking, and the maintaining relationships and such, do those come apart? So do we observe cases where individuals in certain circumstances will exhibit one of those aspects of social motivation but not others, or do they always come together as a one package?
Yeah, I think that they can come apart, that we can really identify various, including biological mechanisms that tells them apart. There are people who naturally get oriented to social stimuli, and their attention to social stimuli is very standard. But then the rewards that they get from social interactions is not as large as other people. I think that we do have the intuition that those things can happen. Some people get a lot of pleasure from social interactions, but perhaps they're unaware of how much their reputation is at stake when they behave in a certain way. So yes, I believe that those things can be studied separately. And perhaps more importantly, I believe that social motivation can be very different from social cognition.
Could you care to explain what social cognition is very quickly?
Yes, so perhaps taking a step back, I think that one fundamental insight of cognitive science has been to tease apart people's competence and people's performance. And there's a range of reasons why people may be competent in a certain area of their life and may perform in a way that isn't aligned with their competence. And that has been true for language. In fact, Noam Chomsky is the first researcher to have emphasized the very important distinction between one's competence and one's performance. And I guess I see social cognition and social motivation in the same way. So to get back to your question of what is social cognition, and then maybe we can dig a bit deeper into the distinction between the two. Social cognition refers to a range of mechanisms that lead individuals to perceive, to understand, and to react to social information. And that means that social cognition encompasses various functions, for example, the perception of social signals, the detection of faces from the youngest age, memory for social information. There's lots of evidence showing that we're very good at memorizing faces. Even several years apart, we can remember that we met once. Of course, there are individual differences in that function. Theory of mind and perspective taking and empathy. So really the ability to try and take somebody else's insights and to understand that what I think is different to what you think. And to understand that even though I do not feel the way you feel, I understand the way you feel. That's empathy. And I care about it. Social emotions, that's also part of social cognition. For example, anger is very much a social emotion. Pride. And finally, social learning, which is our ability to observe other people and learn from their behavior, either by imitating or simply by observing them and getting more information about the world. All of those things, all of those functions of social cognition influence social decision-making, social judgment, and our behavior more generally.
So you mentioned something very interesting about social emotions. Are there emotions that are not social?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, there was an exchange recently on X about this very topic where a colleague of mine was saying, the more I think about it, the more I'm thinking that actually every emotion is social in nature. And thinking about it, I can't think of any emotion that isn't social. I guess when you're sad, you can be sad for reasons that are not social. So perhaps it's a bit of a stretch, but I do agree actually with that colleague of mine that the more you think about it, the more you realize that many of our emotions have some sort of social root.
But you emphasized that anger was very much a social emotion. And then you mentioned, I think it was pride.
Yes.
And intuitively, when you think of anger next to pride seems intuitively way more social than anger. And one could think, well, no, there are many times in my life when I've been angry at my computer or whatever. So there must be some emotions that are more social than others. And do you think this is the case, or do you think they're all equally social?
No. I think that I think that emotions are manifestations of motivations, and those motivations can be social or non-social, and social and non-social motivations can trigger emotions that are the same. For example, anger, as you said, you have, say, motivation to perform well, and for that you need your computer to work well. And when you make the experience of your computer not working well, then this motivation for performance will activate an emotional system, which will include anger. But if you don't treat me well and you're rude to me, then I have a motivation to ensure that my status is preserved and that people respect me so that my image is good. That's also going to activate a range of emotions, including anger. So emotions are not fully social or fully non-social. It's more, I would say, a statistical or frequency approach that we could have to emotions, thinking that some emotions are called upon more frequently in social or non-social contexts. But they're not in and of themselves social or non-social. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so these are things to do with our current environments, the frequency of our motivations leading to such and such emotional environment. But more generally too, for functions of social cognition, we can think about what their origin is, what their evolutionary origin is. And maybe this is a way in which emotions could be all social if their evolutionary origin were social. So can you say something about what the evolutionary function of origins of social cognition is hypothesized to be?
You're right, and I'm happy that you're using a plural form here, talking about the evolutionary origins. So we humans are very special in the animal realm because of the ecological niche we occupy. Homo sapiens are social beings, and they thrive in an ecological niche where individuals are highly interdependent. We live in groups. We work together to obtain common benefits. We hunt together. We rear children together. And that means that we're very calibrated to survive in groups, to cooperate, and to reciprocate. Those things are motivations, the motivations I was talking about earlier, that will call upon various emotions. So social cognition helps us with all of this, with surviving in group, cooperating, reciprocating, by helping us navigating very complex social hierarchies, by facilitating coordination, by helping us detect who cheats and who doesn't. We're also helped in our motivation to live in group by our ability to communicate, notably through language. I mean, this is very special to the human species. Language, why is language so important? Well, because it's very efficient in exchanging information, because beyond what we can see directly, representing things that we cannot see here and now, and discussing, like we're doing right now, things that are absent in the environment. The reason why it's so powerful for social cognition is because this can help us spread people's reputation much faster than if we just had to observe people when they interact socially with others. So we can go beyond what most animals can do, which is look at interactions between individuals, see that one individual is nice and the other is not nice, and remember that. We can do that, but we can do more. We can talk about the fact that one individual was nice or not nice to many people, which means that the strength of reputation-based cooperation is much higher in humans than it is in other species.
But so this is very interesting, because couldn't one sort of argue that animal vocalizations might be representing certain reputational information that we just don't understand? Isn't that a possibility?
It is a possibility, and actually I'm not an expert in that respect, and you need to speak to people who know much more than I do about animal communication. My understanding of the field right now is that what we can say is that the strength of what is communicated by non-human animals is simply not the same as what we can achieve with a highly recursive language, and that our representational abilities are very different.
To sort of circle back to one of the themes that is sort of recurrently coming up during our conversation is about individual differences and the different functions that you just described to us about different social cognitive processes. So could you maybe just elaborate a bit on what we know about some of the cross-cultural differences and some of the functions that you've been describing, like social orientation or social maintenance? Maybe some cultures don't derive as much pleasure from interactions, let's say. I don't know of any such culture, but you could educate us on that if you know about this.
Yes, I think that my opinion is that the basic mechanisms that we've been talking about, for example, basic social abilities, recognizing one's conspecific, or the ability to take somebody's perspective, the ability for theory of mind, caring for one's reputation, being involved in reputation-based cooperation, those things are universals of cognition. I strongly believe that. Now, when you've said this, that absolutely doesn't mean that everybody is the same and that every culture is the same. The reason why that doesn't mean that is that those mechanisms will take as input a range of things, including people's prior interaction with others, including what is acceptable to display in your culture. For example, in Japan, it's not very acceptable to display anger. Doesn't mean that people don't experience anger, but perhaps they display it in a different way. So I think that what's been happening in the past half century is that cognitive science have moved from a model where we first went against the very strong behaviorist movement by going inside the black box and saying there are universal rules that explain why people behave the way they behave, and that is universal. We've moved from that to still acknowledging this, but also thinking about and accepting and recognizing the huge variability between people. But you can accept the fact that an identical mechanistic system will look differently if it takes as inputs things that are different. So people living in different environments will behave differently. We should, in fact, expect that.
And so I'm also, this is just something that I'm individually curious about, because it also seems like these are topics that historically social psychology has cared about as well. And so why do we use the term social cognition for the same amount of processes that social psychology is explaining? Are there differences between these two approaches, let's say?
I think that we would have to take specific examples, and very often social psychology and social cognition are looking at the same objects and they're trying to do the same thing. Perhaps social psychology is more interested in behaviors and less in processes that happen in the mind and that are hidden in the mind, as the ones that I was talking about, emotion, memory, perspective taking, and all those things. And perhaps they adopt a more inter-individual perspective, so looking at the way people behave in the presence of others depending on whether they're dominant or not dominant, for example.
Right.
But there are many examples where those two subdisciplines of psychology work well together and in fact are doing the same thing. I would say that what is different is whether or not you adopt an evolutionary approach to those phenomena.
Okay. Because social psychology doesn't do that.
Not necessarily. Some do, but not necessarily.
Okay.
And so we talked about inter-individual differences in social motivation, cognition, which brings us back to autism spectrum disorders, because as you mentioned, it's been observed that people with ASDs have different kinds of social cognition or maybe certain deficits or whatnot. So can you maybe walk us through what autism spectrum disorders are and how do people who have them differ from the story you've been telling up until now?
Yeah, so first, perhaps we should think about the way in which social motivation and social cognition develops over somebody's life course. What we've been hinting at so far by talking about evolution, by talking about the difference between the human species and other non-human animals, is that there's something innate, there's something of an instinct, something that's there from the beginning. And that's certainly true, that infants from the time they're born, as early as we can test them, actually a few days old, are attuned to social information. They prefer looking at things that look like faces than looking at things that don't look like faces. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is there from the beginning, of course. And in fact, what we see of social motivation and social cognition is that it's exquisitely attuned to the need of humans at each developmental stage. So, for instance, social cognition in adolescence looks very different to social cognition in children, in younger children. In adolescence, there's a drive to sort of get out of the very strong relationship with one's parents,
Yes.
who in fact are the only provider of resources at that point of people's development. So there's a drive to get away from that and find one's own group. And that triggers a very, very powerful social drive and also a completely different way of displaying one's skills, of taking a risk and so on. I'm saying all of this to say that autism spectrum conditions are to be thought of in development as well. So when you test people with an autism spectrum condition when they're very young, when they're babies, for example, you're going to be interested in checking whether what should be there from the very beginning is there. So do babies with an autism spectrum condition pay just as much attention as babies who don't have that condition? The answer is no. They tend to not look at faces, to not prefer to look at faces as much as babies who do not develop an autism spectrum condition. But of course, when you study adolescents with an autism spectrum condition, the manifestations that you're going to check for are very different. And perhaps you're going to be more interested in the way teenagers with an autism spectrum condition care about their reputation or not, knowing that people who do not have that condition maximally care about their reputation during adolescence. So these conditions are characterized by difficulties in social communication. That includes verbal and non-verbal communication skills. A particular way of using gestures, expressions, a tone of voice, which brings us back to what we were saying earlier, which is that a lot of our emotions are in fact social in nature. The reason why we display anger is that we believe that anger needs to be seen. So people with an autism spectrum condition, not surprisingly, have a different way of expressing their emotions. There's a lot of social cognition differences. Some people have emphasized the existence of theory of mind deficits, or at least difficulties with social cues, social motivation differences, and also things that are not social, sensory difficulties and repetitive behaviors that are not obviously social in nature.
So what's up with that? It seems like all the deficits that you have described up till the repetitive actions just seem to be inherently social, but the repetitive actions in itself just seem like non-social in nature. So why would this symptomatology accompany this range of other social, let's say, deficits?
Yes, I don't think anyone knows why those two things are associated. Many people would want to see this as two sides of the same coin. It seems like it would be such an achievement intellectually to see the link between a social condition and repetitive behaviors and sensory particularities. I myself have been tempted to speculate on how the two may be related, but I don't think that it goes beyond the speculation, so I'm not going to comment on that.
Yeah, it's a lot. It seems like a large gap to fill.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, you use the word condition rather than disorder. Is there any important reason behind that terminological choice, or is it to do with destigmatization, or is it just?
Yes, I think it's exactly that. I think that. When you use the term disorder, then it implies that this is something to be fixed. And certainly in some forms of that condition, I'm thinking of children, parents would want their children to get help and to have access to therapies that will help them lead a happier life and a life where they can be included in standard educational settings and so on. But for people who have milder forms of the condition, it's not at all clear that it's a disorder. And I respect that. And then it's a whole empirical discussion and frankly, political discussion to decide where on the spectrum we stop saying condition and we say disorder or handicap. It's at this point, the debate is heated and I don't think anybody has a consensual answer.
So now what is the more precise link between social motivation and autism spectrum conditions?
Yes, so the reason why I said earlier that social cognition and social motivation can be two different things is important here. Because it is very possible that people have intact social cognition, meaning that they can understand the social world, they can compute the social world. So it's not like somebody who would have prosopagnosia and does not recognize faces. In that case, you have a pathology of cognition, really, of recognizing faces. So it's very possible that some people have intact social cognition, but have a different social motivation. To take another example, completely outside the realm of autism, it is fully possible to have intact sexual abilities. So you have the ability to reproduce, you have the ability to have sexual intercourse, but to have no motivation to do so. And in fact, amongst the various sexual identities that people identify with, asexuality is one of them. So you see here in a very sort of intuitive way the distinction that can exist between the competence and the performance. And in that case, the distinction between competence and performance is one of motivation. Okay? That is exactly the point I tried to make about autism, that it is very possible that the competence is not as impaired as we thought in the beginning, but the motivation to resort to that competence is impaired.
So this is a very interesting disentanglement between competence and performance that has been recurring throughout our conversation. So I was wondering about how this disentanglement has implications on treatment for such conditions.
Yeah. So the implication is massive, actually, because if you think that the reason why people behave differently is that they have a different skill set, different competence, and in one group, the competence is impaired, then you need to work on the competence. So you need to explain why people behave in a certain way. You need to explain what is a face and what is not a face and how social interactions work. But if you think that people have that intact competence to start with, and the reason why they behave differently is that they're not motivated to attend to social signals as much, then the therapy is going to look very different. The therapy is going to be about trying to make social interactions more rewarding.
And how would that work? Like, do you have a clue about this?
Yes, I think that in the cognitive behavioral therapies that have been used, do things that are very inspired by behaviorism, where you simply pair social interaction with a reward that is non-social. And those therapies have been found to be effective, but they've also been criticized because they work as pure training to guide children towards liking something that they didn't like in the first place. Okay. And again, knowing whether or not that is the right course of action depends on the severity of the condition, I think, and also depends on the suffering of the individual.
Right.
If somebody is perfectly happy, not very motivated by social interactions, then and functions well and is not depressed and so on, then there's no reason a priori why we should try and fix it.
So this seems like more of a ongoing political discussion.
It is very much ongoing, and it is very, again, it's a very heated discussion.
Let's move on to another theme of your work, which has been exploring the links between our environments and our cognitive mechanisms. And so more precisely, you have been interested in how uncertainty, stress, and environmental harshness affect different cognitive processes and decisions. So could we just start off with defining these three factors?
Sure. You see that there's a link between the two themes, and the link is that there's a huge amount of variability that we need to account for. And one source of variability may be motivation. Motivation can affect the way people display and experience social interactions. And another source of variability is the environment in which people live. So you mentioned three factors: uncertainty, which refers to living in an environment that is not predictable. Not predictable means that the outcomes of what you're doing are not clear, or you have incomplete information. Stress is a psychological response to those challenges. Environmental harshness is the degree of difficulty or adversity that is around a person. And that can be things like resource scarcity, not having enough to live on, competition for resources, or exposure to threatening conditions. So all of those things, all of those concepts are descriptions of reasons why somebody may be in an uncomfortable environment, rather than what some people call a hopeful ecology, which I like a lot. You can be in an environment that is hopeful in the sense that you feel like the level of resources you have is very predictable and is plentiful, and you're not exposed to threats or stressors. and that leads to being hopeful.
And so, what benefits scientifically does focusing on these three factors have, and particularly in development in childhood?
So the reason why I've been interested in those factors is that there's evidence that they have an impact on cognition. And it's not very recent, the focus on trying to understand what living in an hopeful or adverse ecology does to the developing mind. But we now know that uncertainty can lead people to have a mental load that's increased, and so it makes them take decisions in a different way. We know that, for example, living in uncertain environments in and of itself increases people's sensitivity to potential threats. So they will tend to detect things that are not threatening as threatening. The threshold for detecting threat is lower, which means that anxiety can be more present. When people are exposed to chronic stress that has consequences for attention, memory, decision-making, so basically all of cognition. When people are exposed to acute stress, they may have a fight or flight response where they will prioritize very immediate needs at the expense of longer-term decisions, which again is basically all of life priorities.
Right.
Very much about prioritizing short-term versus long-term benefits. We know also that people living in harsh environments develop cognitive adaptations that will help them prioritize the short term over the long term. And that's going to change their perception of risk and the way they make decisions. And as you can see, I've used the term adaptation deliberately, not in the sense of evolutionary adaptation, but rather in the sense of calibration. I believe that our cognition is calibrated to the environment in which it is held. And I really think that we should not think of those different behaviors as biases or abnormal reactions, but rather as something that is to be expected when people are exposed to stressors and scarcity.
So what implications, if we subscribe to this view of the link between environment affecting cognition, what implications does this have for designing public policies that could sort of help people who occupy, let's say, less hopeful ecologies, as you put it?
I think that understanding the way in which humans adjust to challenges is really fascinating, because it brings together what we know about universals of cognition, like I was saying in the beginning, and the plasticity of those mechanisms. And it's really fundamental for public policies to take this into account. If public policies get inspired by what we know of the human mind, it's progress, because public policies are ultimately for citizens. They're made to benefit citizens. So it's a good thing if public policies take into account the way citizens think. But public policies must take into account the fact that there's also variability. So it's true that we have many things in common. For example, if I'm interested in designing pedestrian crossing, then I better know that the human visual system will see white over black very easily, and that if I choose a gray pedestrian crossing, people are not going to see it. Okay, this is public policy that's inspired by cognition. It's inspired by what we know of the visual system.
Is that the actual origin of the way public crossings are designed? Were they actually based on studies, or was it like an intuitive thing?
I think it was. It's very intuitive, but it's really to attract people's attention to the fact that we need public policies to adjust to the way we function. So if you want to design a a crossing that's designed for dogs, for example, whose visual system work completely differently, you better know what colors they see. So it's trivially the case that public policies need to adjust to the way psychology work in the case of the visual system. Okay. So I think that the main implication for public policy of what I've just said, of the link between harshness and cognition, is that we should expect people living in different conditions to behave differently. And we should stop thinking about this as a bug. It's not a bug, it's a feature of our cognitive system and of our behavioral system. It's not a deviation from the norm. It's not irrational. Living in adverse conditions will produce and should produce different reactions. It would be extremely bizarre if people living in hopeful ecologies with plentiful resources would think and behave exactly in the same way as people living in scarce environments. So the goal of public policies should be to anticipate these differences and to adjust policies to ensure that the beneficiaries of public policies actually do get access to the public policies. I don't know if you know, but there's something like 30% of aid that is not collected by people who would be entitled to collect aid. So that means that the people who need aid the most don't get the aid that states have designed and made available to them. And one of the reasons why they don't get the aid is that very often getting the aid is extremely complex. So it's not enough to just have thought of making public policies that will provide aid to people. You also need to think about the journey that people will need to go through in order to access aid, taking into account that their mental load may be very different to the mental load that people living in resourceful ecologies may experience.
So you phrased your answer in a way that sort of conveys that public policy has been historically ignoring psychological research. And would you know why that would be the case? Is it just a historical artifact?
I think that the reason is that we focus on technicalities. So let's think back to the COVID pandemic. We were facing a situation where there was a disease that was progressing and we had no treatment and no vaccination. Now, the urgent thing is to find a technological device that will help us not catch the disease. That's called a vaccine. So the focus of the public policy is to get the vaccine. And it ignores the fact that once we have the technological solution, it doesn't mean that we're going to agree to getting vaccinated, that we're going to take the time to do it, because maybe we don't feel that we individually are at risk of getting adverse consequences from COVID, and so on and so forth. I believe also that decision makers think that once they've identified a solution, if the solution is efficient, then people are just going to take up the solution. And they sometimes fail to see that the whole logic that has led a decision maker to design a public policy in a certain way is completely opaque to a random citizen in the street. So just like, in cognitive science, we talk a lot about the curse of knowledge. For teachers, when you're teaching, there are so many things that you've forgotten what others do not know. I think it's a bit the same in
podcasting.
Podcasting, yeah, exactly.
No, yeah, sorry.
Exactly. But when you're creating a public policy, you believe that your intentions are evident, and once you've found the solution, you think, oh yes, that's the solution, and you're super excited about your solution. But you fail to see that the 60 million people living in France haven't gone through that thought process, and they don't have intimately the conviction that you have that the solution is good. They've never thought of it.
They're too busy doing paperwork.
They're too busy doing paperwork, exactly.
But so you've also done some field work, participated in some field studies, and so it's all well and good to say that public policy should be more evidence-based and base itself on psychology. Lots of psychology comes from work in laboratories with highly controlled conditions. So do you think that field studies have a special role to play in informing public policy?
I think they have a fundamental role to play in forming public policies. And in fact, I got convinced of that when doing autism work during my postdoc in the US, where in my lab, there was a team doing what's called implementation science. Implementation science is you have a therapy that works to help children with autism feel better or get better results in cognitive tests, imagine. You know it works because you've tested it rigorously in the lab and you've compared people with autism and matched controls, and you've trained a team of clinical psychologists to adhere to the treatment delivery in a very strict way. And you know that your effect size is moderate, let's say. But obviously, you can't deliver treatment in those conditions all the time, so you have to deliver treatment in real life. And every time what happens is that when the therapy is brought in the field, in the real messy life, then the effect size shrinks. And sometimes shrinks so much that it becomes null. And the reasons are multiple. The reasons can be that you thought of a therapy that should be 10 hours a week, but actually in schools, there's not enough money, or there's also an outing to the zoo and you're not going to tell the kid that he can't go to the zoo, so he's going to miss one session.
That would be very cruel.
That would be very cruel. The teachers are trained, but not as rigorously as the clinical psychologist would be. There's noise, etc., etc. And in the end, what do we care about? If we care about psychology and we really want to understand the mind, then it's fine to have done the lab work. It's enough to have done the lab work because you've discovered that by exposing children with a certain condition to this and this therapy that rests on this and that mechanism, you've changed the outcome. So you've learned something scientifically. But if what you care about is changing the lives of people, it doesn't matter that it works in theory, it needs to work in practice. So I think we need both. We need to do the lab work to get an idea of what could work in the real, messy, complex world. But then we shouldn't take for granted that what works in very well-controlled experiment, if left in the wild, is going to have the same effects. So I think we need both.
So do you think that the next generation of scientists should be trained with some of the shortcomings that you mentioned? Like, obviously, a necessary skill set is to conduct well-controlled lab studies, but also it seems that you also need to understand the deviations in which could very much destroy the design when put out in the wild. Is that something you think is a change needed in graduate education for the next generation?
Yeah, I think that people should be aware and humble. They should be aware of what's going to happen to great effect when it goes in the wild. They should know. And the reason they should know is that it's very humbling to realize that something that works, including really well, can stop working when real life kicks in. But I don't think that people should do both. I like doing both, but I think that it's also fine to divide and conquer. And some people may focus on lab experiments and they're going to be really good at that. Other people can focus on field experiments. Actually, it's a completely different skill set. And I never do a field experiment by myself. I actually can't do it. I collaborate with economists who have specific training to do that. As long as people realize the shortcomings of their methods, it's fine. So I don't think that people should do anything.
Fair. So you've also been talking a lot with policymakers and sort of conducting these field studies and sort of trying to influence public policy. How has the conversation been like? Or what is it like to talk to policymakers? Are they usually receptive to the ideas that you put forward to them?
Actually, they are. I think that there's this general way of thinking of policymakers as narrow-minded and not open to scientific expertise. But overall, that's not been my experience. My experience has been that once you explain what the results of science should look like and what the implications for policy making should be, most people actually listen. Now, they're also dealing with their own set of constraints because they work in the messy world where you have to react quickly. When I talked about field work, for example, one of the biggest field study that I've conducted with my colleague Élise Huillery, who's an economist, on education in middle school, we started working on that project 10 years ago and it's not published. And it's not because we've been slow. It's because it was a massive project. So policymakers need to find the right balance between taking the results of science into account and acting. And sometimes they stop listening to the science because the need for action is larger. And of course, that's not good. But again, my personal experience has been that most of the time they listen.
And so it seems like they're listening because there's this whole movement, let's say, in public policy of listening to people from behavioral economics and the whole nudge literature, which our previous guest Stefano also talked about. So it already seems like, and some of the ideas that we discussed previously in our conversation so far do seem to touch on those themes that have public policy implications. So is cognitive science adding something over and above behavioral economics and, let's say, the traditional nudge literature?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that it's adding something. What it's adding is cognition. What it's adding is not behaviorism. That's what it's adding. There's a difference between looking at the way people behave in tasks and understanding the mechanisms that lead people to behave the way they behave. And I'm talking here about proximate reasons, like what's happening in their brain, but also ultimate reason, what ultimately is the motivation for people to care about their reputation, behave differently when they're watched or not watched. Once you understand the deeper reasons for people's behavior, that means that you can design policies that are much better suited to people's deep motivation, not just to people's observable behavior. So I believe that the difference is the difference between cognitive science and behaviorism.
Some of this work, looking at how we can take into account what's actually going on in the mind, to understand and implement public policy, has focused on how we can tackle the climate change crisis. So can you describe some of your work in this area?
Yes, so I've been working with Mathilde Mus and Hugo Mercier on the acceptability of environmental policies. And the first study that we conducted together is one about the carbon tax. And the reason why we got interested in the carbon tax is that if you talk to economists, there's a consensus, and actually it's not that common, that there's a consensus among economists about what we should be doing. But for the carbon tax, economists say that is exactly what we have to do. We need to put a price on carbon and it needs to be higher than the one that is currently implemented. But of course, the acceptability of tax increases is not exactly high. So we were wondering whether there was something in the way the carbon tax had been presented at least in France a few years ago, that could explain people's reaction to the carbon tax. Of course, one of the reasons why people protest against tax increases is if the tax increase is perceived as unfair, and if redistribution hasn't been planned in the design of the new tax. But there's another reason which we thought had been underexplored, which is that we tend to think of the state's budget as we think of our own budget. And the way we deal with our own budget, because it's complicated to deal with a budget, is by imagining that we have little envelopes, with an envelope for going to the restaurant and an envelope for paying the rent and an envelope for going to the movies. And those envelopes are not necessarily, what's the word? They don't communicate necessarily. They're not fungible, which is weird for an economist, because for an economist, money is money. But we think of money as tagged. This is my movie money. This is my drinks money. And the reason we know this is because if you give a voucher to someone for drinks, say a 30 euros voucher for drinks, they're going to increase their drink expenditure by about 30 euros, which seems intuitive like that. But in fact, it's weird, because 30 euro is 30 euro. So you could just as well use the 30 euro for drinks and use the money that you would have used for drinks to do other things. Okay, so it's as if we had those little mental budgets. And what we thought is that perhaps the carbon tax is a little bit like that. If you ask people to give more money to the state and you say, we're going to take money from your carbon expenditure and then we're going to use it to do whatever, to fund the hospital, to fund schools, to fund the army, everything, then we resist, because we have those envelopes. So if I put more money in environment-related things, then it should be spent on environment-related things. So we tested what it would change in people's self-reported acceptability of the carbon tax if we told people that all of the money is going to be spent on environmental projects. And the answer is that it boosts the acceptability of the tax to very high level. Then we thought, do we need to give all of the money? Do we need to flag all of the money, or can we keep part of the money for other purposes? So we checked, what does it change if 20%, 40%, 60%, and so on. And in one condition, we said, let's say 75%. And the acceptability is the same if you say 75 or 100. So we thought, okay, so let's say that the 25% that's left, we redistribute it. Do people feel happy about that? And the acceptability went one level up when we said this. And then we thought, okay, one last step. If we redistribute and we flag the redistribution and say we're going to redistribute to poorer households for their environmental related needs, like insulation in their home, for example. And that boosts acceptability even more.
So if we really wanted to implement these ideas in public policy, we could imagine. So in these cases, it seems like intuitively, it would like the actual things that people seem to want make sense and would be fair to a certain extent. But we could also imagine in other domains, or maybe even this domain, people wanting things that wouldn't make sense to scale of public policy. And if you were to implement these things, and if you were to say, okay, we're going to do this, you have to actually do it, right? So is there a risk sometimes of maybe, so how do you balance actually giving people what they would want in order to make them behave right, and then also doing things that actually make sense? Is there a way of balancing those things?
That's a question for a political scientist or a politician. What we can do as cognitive scientists is say, look, in the current state of what people understand, this is the way people are going to react to various policies. It doesn't mean that it's the right or the wrong policy. This is for people who do political science or ethics or normative sciences, which cognitive science doesn't do.
Yeah.
We're agnostic as to what is the right thing to do. What we can say is, given what we know of people's psychology, that is the way they're going to react. And just to react on one thing you said, if we were to implement this right now, it's feasible, but the reason why states haven't done it is that if you start saying that taxes are earmarked to a particular domain of expenditure, the budget of the states becomes unmanageable.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense.
It just doesn't make any sense. So what we could say is, okay, if there's a climate emergency, I mean, given that there is a climate emergency, it's fine to make an exception and to earmark the revenues of the carbon tax if this can help us implement the tax faster. But we need to acknowledge that it can't be done for every tax.
Yeah. This prompts a further question, though, because people who do public policy and then also maybe political scientists would have to pay attention to this behavioral and cognitive data. But you could also imagine someone trying to figure out the best way to educate people on what makes sense. And this seems to be the kind of ball coming back to the cognitive or behavioral scientist here. Are there examples of this?
What I know is that people who've done graduate studies in economics have intuitions that are very different. So I do think that pedagogy can go a long way. And we certainly shouldn't give up on explaining, for example, hidden costs. For instance, if you... or hidden consequences of policies. And I'm a strong believer of the fact that people can learn a lot. And you mentioned that you had seen Hugo Mercier earlier. So he also is a strong believer of the fact that if you give people the opportunity of seeing arguments and of making their collective intelligence work, then they will land on solutions that are actually much better than if you leave them alone and don't provide information. So I think that all of this is compatible and complementary.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I think, so we are ending the conclusion of our episode. But one last thing we could broach is your work with the French government on handling the COVID-19 crisis. Could you quickly give us a brief overview of what that looked like?
That was a very interesting moment for everybody, I think. Everybody has a special recollection of the lockdown, or the first lockdown, because it was the one that was really massive. And I had the opportunity of working in that unit. And it was very special because I was surrounded by people who are public decision makers. And I was the only academic.
Oh, wow.
So that's why I was saying earlier that my perception is that it isn't the case that they're not ready to listen. What is the case is that their constraints are completely different from ours. And also that the public decision world and the academic world are very foreign to one another. And they're not used to working together, except economists. I think economists are very much used to being at the frontier between academia and public decision making. But in cognitive science, we're not very much used to it. So a lot of what I did was to do the pedagogy of what it means to communicate in a time of crisis. And the reason why a behavioral and cognitive science approach was needed in that unit is that at the time, the only solution was behavioral. There was no vaccination, there was no treatment. So when the country was going to reopen, what people needed to change was their behavior on a massive scale. Now, I don't know if we did a good job or not. I'm not sure. But it was a very interesting time.
Yeah, whatever changes that brought about are no longer visible, probably. So, yeah.
Exactly.
So before we end, we always ask if there's something that you would like to follow up on or clarify, or something we didn't talk about that you think is very important related to the topics we discussed.
what could I say?
You did a good job at covering everything.
No, I think maybe I would like to conclude on the fact that there are more and more people studying cognitive science who realize the value of cognitive science to change the world. And it's absolutely wonderful. And I hope that we can be a good incubator to this enthusiasm, an enthusiasm that needs to remain very modest and humble for all the reasons that I've mentioned earlier.
And do you have any recommendations for a book or any piece of media that our listeners could sort of look up to which sort of reflect the themes of the conversation that we have been having so far?
Maybe I can recommend another podcast if you don't mind me recommending something.
No worries.
The one by the dissenter, who he does a lot of interviews with cognitive scientists. Usually they're like an hour long, and he goes deep into questions that many cognitive scientists are interested in. So not a book, but another podcast, The Dissenter.
Great. This has been Cognitations, a cognitive science podcast competing with The Dissenter. We have been chatting with Coralie Chevalier. Thanks so much for being here. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
On the next episode of Cognitations, we'll chat with Alex Christian and Camilla Scarf about language acquisition, child-directed speech, and much more. If you have ever wondered about how we acquire language, this episode is not to be missed.